Margaret Whitfield's weathered hands trembled as six full-grown African lions formed a protective circle around her, their amber eyes never leaving the rifle pointed at her chest. The dying lion cub in her arms let out a weak mew that pierced the tense silence of the Masai Mara. This wasn't supposed to happen. The largest lioness stepped forward, positioning herself between the 68-year-old grandmother from Ohio and the armed man who had been hunting her pride. Jimmy Anderson dropped his camera, the metallic clatter echoing across the savannah as he watched the impossible unfold before his eyes. Margaret remembered teaching kindergarten just 6 months ago, reading stories about brave animals to wide-eyed children who would never believe this moment. Now those same children's faces flashed through her mind as she realized the lions weren't just protecting her, they were claiming her as family. "Nobody move," Colonel Stone whispered, his voice cracking with disbelief. How had a desperate search for her granddaughter's cure led to this moment of choosing between two families she loved? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Margaret Whitfield sat in the sterile oncology ward of Columbus Children's Hospital, watching her 8-year-old granddaughter Emma's chest rise and fall with labored breaths. The doctors had delivered their verdict with clinical precision: rare osteosarcoma, aggressive bone cancer, experimental treatment required. The cost, $500,000. Insurance coverage denied. "Grandma, will you tell me about the lions again?" Emma whispered, her small hand finding Margaret's weathered fingers. For 3 years, since her husband Tom's death from COVID, Margaret had filled the silence with stories from old National Geographic magazines, tales of African wildlife that seemed as distant as fairy tales in their Ohio suburb. Margaret had raised Emma alone since her daughter Sarah disappeared into the depths of addiction 2 years ago. At 68, the retired kindergarten teacher lived on Tom's pension and whatever substitute teaching she could manage. The medical bills had already consumed their life savings, and the house Tom built with his own hands now carried a second mortgage. Dr. James Anderson's research paper changed everything. The wildlife veterinarian from Austin had published breakthrough findings about lion bone regeneration in the Journal of Veterinary Medicine. His work at the Hope Foundation in Kenya showed that certain proteins found in African lion milk could accelerate bone healing in ways conventional medicine couldn't explain. The treatment was experimental, unproven in humans, and available only at his remote clinic in the Masai Mara. "Mrs. Whitfield, I understand your desperation," Dr. Anderson had said during their video call, his weathered face framed by the African sunset behind him. "But this isn't a tourist destination. Lions are apex predators, and our work requires years of specialized training. I can't have civilians around dangerous animals." Margaret's response surprised them both. "Doctor, I've handled 500 5-year-olds over 40 years of teaching. They bite, scratch, throw tantrums, and test every boundary you set. How different can lions be?" Behind Jimmy's skeptical expression, something flickered. Maybe it was the steel in her voice, or perhaps the desperate love of a grandmother who'd already lost too much. His own divorce had cost him custody of his 12-year-old son Tyler, who refused his calls and blamed him for choosing research over family. 3 weeks later, Margaret stepped off the small charter plane onto the dusty airstrip of the Masai Mara, carrying a single suitcase and Emma's stuffed lion named Hope. The African sun blazed overhead as Jimmy met her with obvious reluctance. "This is your last chance to change your mind," he warned as they drove toward the research station. "Once you meet them, there's no going back. These aren't zoo animals or pets. They're wild predators who could kill you without a second thought." Margaret clutched Emma's lion tighter, thinking of her granddaughter's latest scan results. "Doctor, I didn't come here for my safety. I came here for hope." The Hope Foundation Clinic sat like a small oasis in the vast Masai Mara, its whitewashed buildings surrounded by acacia trees and the endless golden grassland that stretched to the horizon. Margaret's first glimpse of the lion pride took her breath away. 12 magnificent cats lounged in the shade of a massive baobab tree, their tawny coats gleaming in the afternoon sun. "That's Neota," Jimmy said, pointing to a scarred lioness who dominated the group. "She's the matriarch, about 8 years old. See that mark across her muzzle? Got that defending her cubs from hyenas last year. She's pregnant again, due any day now." Margaret pressed her face to the chain-link fence that separated the observation area from the pride's territory. Neota's amber eyes met hers across the distance, and for a moment time seemed suspended. The lioness tilted her head, studying the elderly woman with an intensity that made Margaret's heart race. "She's beautiful," Margaret whispered. "She's also killed 3 poachers in the last 2 years," Jimmy replied grimly. "Never forget what you're dealing with here, Mrs. Whitfield. These aren't house cats." That evening, Margaret video-called Emma from her small guest quarters. Her granddaughter's face appeared on the screen, pale and drawn, but brightening at the sight of her grandmother. "Grandma, did you see the lions? Are they as big as in the movies?" Margaret held up her phone to show Emma the view from her window, where the pride was settling in for the night. "Bigger, sweetheart, and one of them is going to have babies soon, just like Hope." She held up Emma's stuffed lion. "Will you bring me a picture of the baby lions?" "I'll bring you something better than pictures," Margaret promised, though she wasn't sure what that would be. The next morning brought chaos. Jimmy burst into Margaret's quarters before dawn, his face grim with urgency. "Neota's in labor, but something's wrong. The cub is breached, and she's been struggling for hours. In the wild, she'd likely lose both herself and the baby." Margaret followed him to the medical facility, where they could monitor Neota through reinforced glass. The proud lioness lay on her side, panting heavily, her body racked with contractions that seemed to accomplish nothing. "Can't you help her?" Margaret asked. "Not without sedating her. And that could kill the cub. Lions in labor are incredibly dangerous. One wrong move, and she'd tear me apart, even if she's dying." They watched helplessly for another hour as Neota's strength ebbed. Margaret found herself whispering prayers she hadn't spoken since Tom's funeral, her hands pressed against the glass that separated her from the suffering animal. Then something extraordinary happened. Neota's eyes found Margaret's through the glass and held them. The lioness dragged herself closer to the window, still in the throes of labor, until she was mere inches from where Margaret stood. "She's trying to tell us something," Margaret breathed. Jimmy grabbed his equipment. "I'm going in. If she attacks me, at least we tried." "Wait," Margaret said, her voice surprising them both with its authority. "Let me go with you." "Absolutely not. You're not trained for this." "Doctor, I've delivered 12 babies in my lifetime, 4 of my own grandchildren when Sarah was too high to get to the hospital. Maybe she needs a woman's touch." Against every protocol and his better judgment, Jimmy found himself suiting Margaret in protective gear. As they entered the enclosure, every muscle in his body tensed for an attack that never came. Neota watched them approach, her breathing labored but her demeanor calm. Margaret knelt beside the massive cat, her movements slow and deliberate. "It's okay, Mama," she whispered. "I know it hurts." "I know you're scared." To Jimmy's amazement, Neota allowed Margaret to examine her. The cub was indeed breached, its hind legs appearing first. Margaret had seen this before, in humans and farm animals alike during her childhood in rural Ohio. "We need to turn the baby," she told Jimmy. "Can you sedate her just enough to relax the muscles without putting the cub at risk?" The next hour tested every skill Jimmy had learned in veterinary school and every instinct Margaret had developed through decades of caring for others. Working together, they managed to reposition the cub and guide it into the world. The tiny lion emerged wet and mewing, its left hind leg noticeably deformed. Margaret's heart stopped as she recognized the condition immediately, the same bone deformity that plagued her granddaughter. "My God," Jimmy whispered. "It's the exact same presentation as Emma's condition." Nyota immediately began cleaning her cub, but her eyes never left Margaret. When the exhausted lioness finally relaxed, she did something that would haunt Margaret's dreams and change everything she thought she knew about the boundaries between species. The great cat reached out with one massive paw and gently touched Margaret's hand. The lion cub's first week of life became a testament to both nature's resilience and a grandmother's determination. Margaret named the little one Hope after Emma's stuffed lion, and found herself spending 18-hour days beside the enclosure. The cub's deformed leg made nursing difficult, and Nyota's maternal anxiety was palpable to anyone who watched. "I've never seen anything like this," Jimmy confessed, as they observed Nyota allowing Margaret to bottle feed Hope when the cub grew too weak to nurse properly. "She should be protecting her offspring from any human contact, especially strangers. Instead, she's actively seeking your help." Margaret's weathered hands trembled slightly as she held the feeding bottle. "Maybe she knows I understand. Maybe mothers recognize each other no matter the species." The breakthrough came during Hope's second week, when Jimmy's tests revealed something extraordinary in Nyota's milk composition. The specific proteins that accelerated bone development were present in concentrations he'd never documented before. More remarkably, Hope's deformed leg was already showing signs of natural healing that defied medical explanation. "This could be it," Jimmy told Margaret as they reviewed the lab results. "The key to Emma's treatment, but we need more time to study the progression, to understand how the proteins work." That evening's video call with Emma brought both joy and heartbreak. Her granddaughter's face had grown paler, and the dark circles under her eyes spoke of sleepless nights filled with pain. "How's baby Hope doing, Grandma?" "She's getting stronger every day, sweetheart, just like you will." Margaret held up her phone to show Hope nuzzling against her hand through the fence. "See how she trusts me? Sometimes love is the best medicine." "Mom says you're wasting time playing with animals while I'm dying," Emma said quietly, her words cutting deeper than any blade. Margaret's heart shattered. "Your mother is scared, Emma. Sometimes when people are scared, they say things they don't mean. I'm not playing, sweetheart. I'm fighting for you in the only way I know how." The arrival of Colonel Richard Stone 3 days later shifted the atmosphere at the Hope Foundation like a gathering storm. Stone presented himself as a wildlife photographer documenting African conservation efforts for a veterans therapy program, complete with expensive camera equipment and a charming smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mrs. Whitfield," Stone said, extending a firm handshake during their introduction, "I heard about your remarkable connection with the Pride. As a former Marine, I understand the healing power of nature's warriors." Jimmy welcomed Stone with the respect one veteran showed another, sharing stories of the Foundation's work over dinner. Stone listened intently, asking detailed questions about the lions' behavioral patterns, their territory range, and the security measures protecting them. "You've built something special here, Doc," Stone said, raising his beer in a toast. "These animals are lucky to have someone who understands their value." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the African evening air. Something in Stone's tone when he said value triggered an instinct she'd learned to trust after 40 years of reading difficult children and their even more difficult parents. The next morning brought crisis. Hope had fallen severely ill overnight, her breathing labored and her tiny body burning with fever. Jimmy worked frantically to identify the cause while Margaret refused to leave the cub's side. "It looks like poisoning," Jimmy said grimly after running blood tests. but I can't identify the toxin. Nothing in her environment should have caused this. For 72 hours, Margaret maintained a vigil that tested every reserve of strength her aging body possessed. She held hope during the worst moments, feeling the cub's rapid heartbeat against her palm, whispering the same lullabies she'd sung to Emma during her darkest nights in the hospital. Neota's behavior during this crisis revealed depths of animal emotion that challenged everything Jimmy thought he knew about lion psychology. The lioness refused to eat, pacing restlessly and vocalizing in ways that sounded eerily like human grief. When Margaret entered the enclosure to comfort Hope, Neota positioned herself as a guardian, allowing the human grandmother unlimited access to her dying child. "She knows you're trying to save Hope," Jimmy observed. "She's accepting you as family." On the third night, as Hope's condition reached its most critical point, Margaret made a decision that surprised them both. She lay down inside the enclosure, cradling the dying cub against her chest, while Neota curled around them both in a protective embrace that defied every law of predator behavior. "If this baby is going to die," Margaret whispered, "she won't die alone. And if Emma doesn't make it, at least I'll know I tried everything." The healing began at dawn. Hope's fever broke as the first rays of sunlight touched the African grassland, and her breathing steadied into the rhythm of healthy sleep. By evening, she was nursing again, and within a week she was playing with the boundless energy of a normal cub. But the incident had changed something fundamental in the pride's relationship with Margaret. Neota began grooming her hair during feeding sessions, the same maternal behavior she showed her own offspring. The other lions accepted Margaret's presence without the slightest sign of aggression, and Hope followed her everywhere like an imprinted duckling. "You've achieved something unprecedented," Jimmy told her as they watched Hope tumble around Margaret's feet, while Neota observed approvingly. "Interspecies bonding at this level has never been documented. You're not just studying these animals anymore, Margaret. You're family." Stone watched these developments with increasing interest, his camera clicking constantly as he documented every interaction. His questions grew more specific, more technical, and Margaret began to notice how his presence seemed to agitate the lions in ways that had nothing to do with his unfamiliarity. "Something's not right about him," she told Jimmy after catching Stone measuring distances between the enclosures and the main road. "He's a veteran dealing with PTSD," Jimmy replied. "Sometimes they need structure, routine observations. It helps them process trauma." But Margaret's instincts, honed by decades of protecting children from predators of the human variety, whispered warnings that grew louder each day. The month following Hope's recovery brought profound changes to everyone at the Foundation. Margaret had transformed from a desperate grandmother into something resembling a lion whisperer, spending her days integrated into the pride's daily routines with an ease that defied scientific explanation. She helped with feedings, assisted during Jimmy's medical examinations, and had even begun recognizing the subtle vocalizations that distinguished individual lions' communications. Emma's condition, meanwhile, had stabilized in ways that puzzled her Ohio doctors. The psychological boost from Margaret's daily video calls featuring Hope's progress seemed to be having measurable effects on her granddaughter's recovery. Emma's pain levels decreased, her appetite improved, and she began asking detailed questions about lion behavior that Margaret dutifully researched and answered. "Grandma, why do you think Hope's mama chose you?" Emma asked during one evening call, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "I think sometimes love recognizes love, sweetheart. Maybe Neota could tell I was a mama too, that I understood what it meant to fight for your babies." Jimmy's research had progressed beyond his wildest expectations. The protein analysis from Neota's milk was yielding breakthrough insights into bone regeneration that could revolutionize treatment for conditions like Emma's. International veterinary journals were requesting publication rights, and funding offers from major medical institutions arrived daily. But success brought complications. Government officials had begun making noises about relocating the Pride to a more remote location, away from the growing international attention. Local Maasai elders were pressuring Jimmy to prove the foundation's benefit to their community, while environmental groups criticized any human interference with wild animal behavior. Colonel Stone navigated these tensions with military precision, offering solutions that seemed too convenient to be coincidental. He had contacts in the Kenyan government who could expedite research permits, relationships with international conservation groups who might provide funding, and even connections with security firms who could protect the foundation from increasing threats. "You're in a vulnerable position here, Doc," Stone explained during one of their evening conversations. "Word's getting out about your breakthrough research. There are people who'd kill for access to those lions, especially if the medical applications pan out the way you think they will." Jimmy felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on him. His ex-wife Jennifer had begun calling from Texas, demanding to know when he'd be returning for Tyler's custody hearings. His son refused to speak to him directly, communicating only through terse text messages that made clear his father's absence was unforgivable. "Dad says he's saving the world's animals," Tyler had told his mother, according to Jennifer's latest angry voicemail. "But he can't even save his own family." Margaret witnessed Jimmy's struggle with the recognition of someone who had lived through similar choices. During quiet moments, she shared stories of the times her teaching career had conflicted with her family responsibilities. The parent-teacher conferences she'd missed for Emma's school plays, the evenings spent grading papers instead of reading bedtime stories. "The hardest part of loving people," she told him as they watched Hope play with her makeshift toys, "is learning that sometimes the best way to show that love is through sacrifice they can't understand yet." Their growing friendship provided comfort for both lonely souls, but it also created tension with Stone, whose attention to Margaret had grown increasingly possessive. He found reasons to interrupt their conversations, volunteered for duties that kept him close to her daily routines, and began making comments about the dangers of an elderly woman becoming too attached to wild animals. "These lions aren't pets, Mrs. Whitfield," he warned, after watching her hand-feed Hope during one of the cubs' veterinary checkups. "What happens when you have to leave? What happens to them when they lose their human attachment figure?" The question haunted Margaret because she knew it was valid. Emma's treatment window was narrowing, and eventual return to Ohio was inevitable. But the thought of abandoning Hope in Neota felt like preparing to rip her heart out a second time. The Pride's behavior continued to evolve in unprecedented ways. Neota had begun bringing Margaret gifts, antelope bones, interesting rocks, even colorful feathers, displaying them near the fence where Margaret typically sat. The other lionesses showed increasing tolerance for her presence, occasionally grooming her hair or allowing her to pet their massive heads through the protective barriers. Most remarkably, Hope had begun exhibiting behaviors that suggested she considered Margaret a second mother. The cub would cry when Margaret left for the evening and celebrate enthusiastically when she returned each morning. During feeding times, Hope preferred Margaret's presence to Jimmy's and would only sleep peacefully when she could see the elderly woman nearby. "This level of cross-species bonding is unheard of," Jimmy documented in his research notes. Subject shows clear preference for human maternal figure over available Pride members for comfort and security behaviors. Attachment appears mutual and intensifying over time. But Stone's presence cast an increasingly dark shadow over these remarkable developments. Margaret began noticing discrepancies in his stories, details about his military service that didn't align with his claimed background, knowledge of animal behavior that seemed too advanced for an amateur photographer, and an equipment collection that appeared more suited for surveillance than wildlife documentation. Her suspicions crystallized during a conversation she overheard between Stone and an unknown caller on his satellite phone. Speaking in hushed tones behind the generator shed, Stone's words chilled her to the bone. The Pride is fully mapped now. 12 adults, 2 cubs, predictable movement patterns. The old woman has them completely relaxed around human presence. No, security is minimal. The veterinarian trusts me completely. Yes, the cub with the bone condition would be the premium specimen, but the matriarch is the real prize. Margaret's blood turned to ice as the implications sank in. Stone wasn't a veteran seeking healing through nature photography. He was a scout for something far more sinister, using her bond with the lions to map their vulnerabilities for people who viewed Nyota, Hope, and their family as commodities to be harvested. That evening, she attempted to warn Jimmy, but her concern seemed paranoid even to herself. Stone had been nothing but helpful, professional, and respectful. His explanations for any suspicious behavior were reasonable, delivered with the confidence of a man accustomed to command. Jimmy, overwhelmed by research pressures and family conflicts, dismissed her worries as the natural anxiety of someone unfamiliar with the complexities of African conservation work. "Margaret, you're tired," Jimmy said gently. "You've been pushing yourself 18 hours a day for weeks. Maybe some rest would help put things in perspective." But that night, Margaret lay awake in her small quarters, listening to the sounds of the African night, and wrestling with a growing certainty that evil was closing in around the family she'd found in the most unexpected place. Through her window, she could see Hope and Nyota sleeping peacefully under the stars, unaware that someone was planning to destroy their world. The next morning brought news that shattered any remaining illusions of safety. Jimmy received word that 3 lion prides in neighboring conservancies had been found dead, their bodies mutilated in ways consistent with high-value poaching operations. The killers had taken specific organs and bones prized in traditional Asian medicine, leaving the rest to rot under the merciless African sun. "They're moving closer," Jimmy said grimly, studying the map coordinates of the attacks. "Professional operation, probably supplying international trafficking networks. We need to increase security immediately." Stone volunteered to coordinate enhanced protection measures with local authorities, his military background making him the obvious choice for defensive planning. But Margaret saw something else in his eyes when he studied those same maps, not the concern of a protector, but the satisfaction of a predator closing in on cornered prey. Time was running out for everyone she'd learned to love, and Margaret realized with crystalline clarity that she might be the only person who could save them. The crisis erupted on a sweltering Tuesday morning when everything Margaret had feared began converging into a perfect storm of impossible choices. She was bottle-feeding Hope her morning supplement when Jimmy burst through the clinic doors, his face ashen with panic and his hands shaking as he clutched his phone. "Margaret, we have to evacuate now." His voice cracked with urgency. "Emma's taken a turn for the worse. Her doctors in Columbus say she has maybe 48 hours before her condition becomes irreversible. They need you home immediately, and they need our research data to attempt an emergency treatment protocol." The bottle slipped from Margaret's numb fingers, formula splashing across the concrete floor as Hope mewed in confusion. Through the enclosure fence, Nyota raised her massive head, amber eyes fixed on Margaret with an intensity that seemed to understand something terrible was happening. 48 hours? Margaret whispered, the words barely audible. "The medical transport leaves Nairobi in 6 hours. We can make it if we leave within the hour." Jimmy's voice carried the weight of a man delivering a death sentence to someone he'd grown to love like family. "Margaret, I'm so sorry. I know what this place means to you, but Emma needs you now." Margaret's world tilted on its axis as she processed the impossible mathematics of love and loss. "Emma, her precious granddaughter, who had been fighting for her life while Margaret played surrogate mother to a lion cub thousands of miles away. The child who had asked her to bring back something better than pictures, who had trusted her grandmother to find a miracle in the African wilderness. But as she looked at Hope, now pressing her small body against the fence in search of comfort, Margaret felt her heart being torn in directions that defied human capability. Nyota approached slowly, that magnificent scarred face studying Margaret's expression with the intuitive understanding that had developed between them over weeks of shared motherhood. "I can't just leave them," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "Jimmy, you don't understand. They're not just research subjects to me anymore. Hope thinks I'm her mother. Nyota trusts me with her child's life. If I disappear now—" "They're animals, Margaret." Jimmy's words were gentle but firm. "Emma is your granddaughter, your blood. This isn't even a choice." Before Margaret could respond, Colonel Stone appeared in the doorway, his presence somehow managing to fill the space with an undercurrent of menace despite his concerned expression. He'd obviously been listening, and his timing felt too convenient, too calculated. "Mrs. Whitfield, I'm so sorry to hear about Emma," Stone said, his voice carrying what sounded like genuine sympathy. "But Dr. Anderson is right. Family comes first, especially in a crisis like this." Something in his tone made Margaret's skin crawl. The way he emphasized crisis suggested knowledge he shouldn't possess, and his eagerness to see her leave felt predatory rather than compassionate. "How did you know about Emma's condition?" Margaret asked sharply. "Jimmy just received the call." Stone's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "Sound travels in these thin-walled buildings. I couldn't help but overhear. In situations like this, military training teaches you to act decisively." Margaret felt pieces of a horrifying puzzle clicking into place. Stone's too convenient presence, his detailed knowledge of the pride's routines, his insistence on documenting every aspect of their behavior patterns. The overheard phone conversation about premium specimens suddenly took on new and terrifying significance. "You've been waiting for this?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've been waiting for something to force me away from them." Jimmy looked between them with growing confusion. "Margaret, what are you talking about? Colonel Stone has been nothing but helpful." "Tell him," Margaret challenged Stone directly. "Tell Dr. Anderson what you really do for a living." Stone's military bearing never shifted, but Margaret caught the subtle calculation in his expression as he weighed his options. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to command and comfortable with violence. "Mrs. Whitfield, you're obviously distraught about your granddaughter. Stress can make people paranoid, create conspiracy theories where none exist." He turned to Jimmy with practiced sincerity. "Doctor, perhaps it would be best if Mrs. Whitfield got some rest before making such a traumatic journey." But Margaret's grandmother instincts, honed by decades of protecting children from adults who smiled while harboring dark intentions, were screaming warnings that couldn't be ignored. She stepped closer to Stone, her aged frame somehow managing to project defiance despite the physical disparity between them. "I know what you are," she said quietly. "I know why you're really here." Stone's facade cracked just enough to reveal the predator beneath. "And what exactly do you think I am, Mrs. Whitfield?" "A poacher, a killer, someone who sees my lions as merchandise to be harvested." Jimmy's protest died in his throat as he saw something shift in Stone's demeanor. The helpful veteran photographer was melting away, revealing someone far more dangerous underneath. Stone's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket, where Margaret now noticed the subtle bulge of concealed weaponry. "Your lions," Stone's voice carried a mocking edge, Mrs. Whitfield, these animals don't belong to you. They don't belong to anyone. They're resources, and resources exist to be utilized by those smart enough to recognize their value. The mask was completely off now, and Margaret felt terror crystallize in her chest as she realized how thoroughly they'd been manipulated. Stone hadn't been documenting the lions for conservation purposes. He'd been mapping their vulnerabilities, using her unprecedented access to gather intelligence for a harvesting operation. "How long?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "How long have you been planning this?" Stone checked his watch with practiced precision. "Long enough to know that your emergency flight to Nairobi creates the perfect window of opportunity. The local authorities won't respond to reports of gunfire for at least 3 hours, given their financial incentives to look the other way. By the time anyone investigates, we'll be gone, and these magnificent creatures will be serving their highest purpose in traditional medicine markets that pay premium prices for fresh specimens." Jimmy's face had gone white with horrified understanding. "You're talking about killing them, all of them." "I'm talking about business, Doctor. Do you have any idea what 12 adult African lions are worth on the international market? The bones alone will generate enough revenue to fund my entire operation for the next 2 years. The organs, properly preserved, could set me up for life." Margaret felt something inside her snap, a maternal fury that transcended species barriers and transformed her from frightened grandmother into protective lioness. "Over my dead body." Stone's laughter was genuinely amused. "Mrs. Whitfield, that can certainly be arranged if necessary. But I was hoping you'd be reasonable. Take your medical emergency as the gift it is. Leave quietly, save your granddaughter, and let nature take its course here." "Nature?" Margaret's voice rose with righteous anger. "You call cold-blooded murder nature?" "I call it reality. These animals are dying anyway. Climate change, habitat loss, human encroachment, their extinction is inevitable. I'm simply accelerating the timeline and ensuring their deaths serve a profitable purpose." Through the fence, Nyota had begun pacing with visible agitation, her maternal instincts responding to the tension radiating from the humans near her cub. Hope pressed herself against the barrier, tiny paws reaching toward Margaret as if sensing the approaching danger. The sight of the trusting cub stretching toward her shattered something fundamental in Margaret's heart. This little creature who had survived birth defects and poisoning through sheer will and the love of 2 mothers was now facing execution for the crime of being valuable to monsters who saw life only in terms of profit margins. "Emma will understand," Margaret said quietly, her decision crystallizing with absolute clarity. "When she's older, when she has children of her own, she'll understand that some choices define who we are as human beings." Jimmy grabbed her arm desperately. "Margaret, you can't be serious. Emma is dying. Your own flesh and blood needs you. And Hope needs me too." Margaret's voice carried the finality of a woman who had weighed her soul and found her answer. "I won't abandon her to these monsters." Stone's patience was wearing thin, and Margaret could see him calculating the risks of violence against the timeline of his operation. When he spoke again, his voice carried the cold authority of someone accustomed to eliminating obstacles. "Mrs. Whitfield, you have exactly 30 seconds to make the smart choice. Walk away, save your granddaughter, and live with the knowledge that you chose family over animals. Or stay here and die knowing that your granddaughter's last memory of you will be wondering why she wasn't worth saving." Margaret looked at Jimmy, seeing her own anguish reflected in his eyes. Then she turned toward the enclosure where Nyota and Hope waited, trusting her to protect them from dangers they couldn't comprehend. Time slowed to the rhythm of her heartbeat as Margaret Whitfield prepared to make the most important choice of her life. Margaret's answer came not in words but in action. She stepped away from Jimmy's pleading grasp and moved toward the enclosure gate, her weathered hands working the complex lock system with practiced familiarity. Stone's eyes widened with genuine surprise as he realized the elderly grandmother was choosing to enter the lion's territory rather than flee to safety. "Margaret, no!" Jimmy lunged forward, but Stone's hand shot out to stop him, revealing the pistol that had been hidden beneath his jacket. "Let her go, Doctor." Natural selection in action. Margaret entered the enclosure where Nyota and Hope waited, the massive lioness immediately positioning herself between the approaching human and her cub. But instead of aggression, Nyota's posture conveyed protection. Not protection from Margaret, but protection for her. The great cat had somehow sensed the threatening presence of the armed man outside their sanctuary. "You see?" Stone called out, his voice carrying cruel amusement. "Even they know this is suicide. When they find your body, Mrs. Whitfield, it'll look like a tragic accident. Elderly woman gets too comfortable with wild predators, pays the ultimate price for her foolishness." But the lion's behavior defied Stone's expectations entirely. Instead of attacking the intruder in their space, the entire pride began moving with purpose, positioning themselves between Margaret and the fence where Stone stood with his weapon drawn. Nyota's deep rumble wasn't the growl of a predator preparing to strike. It was the warning of a mother defending her extended family. Margaret knelt beside Hope, cradling the cub against her chest as she had during the poisoning crisis weeks earlier. The little lion pressed against her warmth, tiny paws kneading her shirt in the universal gesture of a child seeking comfort from its mother. "I won't let them hurt you," Margaret whispered into Hope's soft fur. "Whatever happens, baby girl, I won't let them hurt you." Stone's patience evaporated entirely. "Touching last words, Mrs. Whitfield. Jimmy, step away from the fence. What happens next won't be pleasant to watch." "You're insane," Jimmy breathed, his face pale with horror. "She's a 68-year-old grandmother. You can't just murder her in cold blood." "I can do whatever's necessary to protect my operation." Mrs. Whitfield made her choice. Now she'll live with the consequences. Briefly. Stone raised his weapon, but the shot that rang out across the African savanna didn't come from his gun. Margaret heard the distinctive crack of a high-powered rifle from somewhere beyond the clinic buildings, followed by Stone's cry of pain as his pistol went spinning across the dirt. "Drop your weapons and step away from the civilians." The voice carried absolute authority, and Margaret looked up to see Jimmy's son, Tyler, emerging from behind the medical building, flanked by 2 Kenyan Wildlife Service officers in full tactical gear. The 12-year-old boy held a tranquilizer rifle with the confidence of someone who'd been trained by his veterinarian father, while the officers covered Stone with military precision. "Tyler?" Jimmy's voice cracked with disbelief. "How did you... What are you doing here?" "Mom put me on a plane yesterday when she couldn't reach you," Tyler replied, never taking his eyes off Stone. "I've been watching this guy for hours, Dad. He's been making phone calls about harvesting the lions. I recorded everything." Stone clutched his wounded hand, blood seeping between his fingers as he glared at the boy who'd destroyed his carefully laid plans. "You little bastard. Do you have any idea what you've just cost me?" "About 25 years in a Kenyan prison, if we're lucky," one of the officers replied grimly. "Colonel Stone, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit wildlife trafficking, attempted murder, and violation of international conservation treaties." As the officers secured Stone and began reading him his rights in both English and Swahili, Margaret felt her legs give out beneath her. The emotional toll of the last hour crashed over her like a physical weight, and she found herself sobbing uncontrollably while Hope nuzzled against her face with concerned whimpers. Jimmy's phone rang insistently, cutting through the chaos of arrest procedures and tactical communications. Margaret watched his face cycle through confusion, hope, and finally overwhelming relief as he answered the call. "Margaret," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "it's the hospital in Columbus. Emma's condition has stabilized. They said the psychological boost from knowing you're fighting for her, combined with the preliminary protein treatments we sent, she's responding better than anyone expected. The crisis has passed. Margaret's tears shifted from despair to joy so quickly that Hope tilted her head in confusion, as if trying to understand why her human mother's emotional state kept changing. Through the enclosure fence, she could see Tyler watching her with the solemn intensity of a child who'd just witnessed the complexities of adult choices play out in real time. "Did I do the right thing?" she asked the boy who'd saved them all. Tyler considered her question with the seriousness it deserved. "Dad always says that family isn't just about blood. He says it's about who you'd risk everything to protect." The 12-year-old gestured toward Hope and Nyota. "Looks like you found your family, Mrs. Whitfield." But Stone wasn't finished. Even with his hands secured behind his back and blood still dripping from his wounded fingers, his voice carried the venom of a man whose life's work had been destroyed by what he saw as misguided sentiment. "You think this changes anything?" he snarled at Margaret. "You think stopping me saves these animals? There are dozens like me, hundreds of operations across Africa. Every lion that dies of old age or disease is money left on the table. Every cub that grows up healthy is a fortune waiting to be harvested." Margaret stood slowly, still holding Hope, her aged frame somehow managing to project dignity despite the emotional turmoil of the last hour. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd spent 4 decades teaching children the difference between right and wrong. "You're probably right, Colonel. There will always be people like you, people who see life only in terms of profit and loss. But there will also always be people willing to stand against you. Children like Tyler, who refuse to let evil go unchallenged. Researchers like Jimmy, who dedicate their lives to healing instead of harming." She gestured toward the pride, where Nyota had relaxed enough to begin grooming her other cubs while keeping one watchful eye on the humans beyond the fence. "And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we find families in the most unexpected places, families that remind us what love actually looks like when it's not corrupted by greed or hatred, or the kind of emptiness that makes a person think killing magnificent creatures is acceptable." Stone's laugh was bitter and defeated. "Sentimental nonsense from a foolish old woman." "Maybe," Margaret replied calmly. "But this foolish old woman is going home to her granddaughter with proof that miracles are real, that love transcends species, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not for profit or glory, but simply because someone has to stand up and say, 'No more.'" As the officers led Stone away toward their waiting vehicle, Margaret felt Hope relax completely in her arms. The cub's breathing settled into the peaceful rhythm of a child who knew she was safe, protected by someone who would never abandon her to the darkness that existed in human hearts. Jimmy approached the enclosure gate slowly, his face showing a mixture of admiration and concern. "Margaret, we need to talk about what comes next. Emma's stable, but she still needs treatment. The research here is more important than ever, but I can't be in 2 places at once," Margaret finished for him. "I know, Jimmy. I've known all along that this moment would come." Through the fence, Tyler watched the interaction between the adults with the perceptive eyes of a child who'd already learned that love sometimes required impossible choices and heartbreaking sacrifices. Margaret looked down at Hope, then across at Nyota, and finally at the young boy who'd risked everything to protect strangers he'd never met. The solution that had been building in her heart for weeks finally crystallized into words that would change all their lives forever. Margaret's solution emerged not from desperation, but from a clarity born of crisis and love tested by impossible circumstances. As she held Hope and watched Tyler's young face process the complexities of adult choices, she realized that the answer had been building itself throughout their entire journey together. "Jimmy," she said quietly, What if I told you there was a way to save Emma? Continue your research and protect these lions all at the same time." Jimmy's expression shifted from confused hope to skeptical concern. "Margaret, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that your son just proved something remarkable about the next generation. Tyler coordinated with Kenyan authorities, used technology to gather evidence, and took decisive action to protect lives he'd never even met before today." Margaret's voice grew stronger with conviction. "He did all of that because you taught him that family extends beyond blood and because he understands that some fights are worth having." Tyler straightened under her praise, but his eyes remained serious as he processed her words. "Mrs. Whitfield, what are you saying?" Margaret looked directly at the boy who'd saved them all. "I'm saying that Hope and Nyota need a champion, someone young enough to dedicate decades to their protection, someone smart enough to understand both the science and the politics of conservation, someone brave enough to stand against people like Stone." "You want me to stay?" Tyler's voice cracked slightly, caught between the boy he'd been and the young man this crisis was helping him become. "I want you to choose," Margaret replied carefully. "Your father has built something extraordinary here. The research we've developed could save not just Emma, but thousands of children around the world with similar conditions. But that research means nothing if the lions don't survive to provide it." Jimmy's face went through a complex series of emotions as he began to understand what Margaret was proposing. "You're talking about Tyler living in Africa. He's 12 years old, Margaret. His mother would never agree, and I can't ask a child to what? To find purpose? To be part of something bigger than himself?" Margaret's teacher instincts kicked in as she saw the defensive walls Jimmy was building. "Jimmy, how old were you when you decided you wanted to work with animals?" 8, Jimmy admitted reluctantly. "I found an injured hawk and convinced my parents to let me take it to a veterinarian. But that's different. Tyler has school, friends, a normal life in Texas." "Tyler has a father who's doing work that could change the world," Margaret countered. "And he has lions who need protection from people who see them as nothing more than valuable body parts." Tyler had been listening to this exchange with growing intensity, and when he spoke, his voice carried a maturity that surprised all the adults present. "Dad, I've been thinking about this since Mom put me on the plane. She told me about the divorce, about how you chose your work over our family." Jimmy's face crumpled with guilt and pain. "Tyler, Let me finish," Tyler said firmly. "She told me that, but she also told me about the children your research has helped. She showed me the letters from parents whose kids got better because of treatments you developed. She said she was proud of what you do, even if she couldn't live with being second priority." Margaret watched father and son navigate emotional territory that had been mined with years of hurt and misunderstanding. Hope squirmed in her arms, seeming to sense the importance of the conversation happening around her. "What if this time I chose both?" Jimmy asked quietly. "What if instead of picking between family and work, I found a way to make them the same thing?" Tyler's smile was radiant. "Mom said you'd figure it out eventually. She also said to tell you that if I wanted to spend my summers here learning from you, she wouldn't fight it. But the decision had to be mine." Margaret felt pieces of a larger solution clicking into place. "There's more, though. Emma's treatment is going to require ongoing monitoring, periodic adjustments to the protein therapy we've developed. Someone needs to coordinate between the medical facilities in Ohio and the research here in Kenya. Someone with a grandmother's attention to detail and a teacher's ability to explain complex concepts to worried families," Jimmy added, beginning to see the full scope of what Margaret was proposing. "Someone who understands both the lions and the science," Tyler continued, his excitement building. "Someone who could train other people to create connections like yours with Nyota and Hope." Margaret nodded, feeling hope bloom in her chest for the first time since the crisis began. We create a program, part medical research, part conservation education, part family healing. Emma gets her treatment and becomes our first success story. Tyler gets to spend summers learning conservation biology in the field. You get to continue your research with the international support that comes from saving children's lives. And the lions get protection from a network of people who understand their family members, not research subjects. Jimmy finished, his voice filled with wondering possibility. But the logistics of such an ambitious plan weighed heavily on all their minds. The Hope Foundation operated on grant funding that was always uncertain, international travel was expensive, and convincing Emma's doctors to coordinate with an African research facility would require diplomatic skills none of them possessed. It was Tyler who provided the missing piece. "Mrs. Whitfield, what if we made a video? What if we showed the world what really happened here today?" Margaret looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" Tyler pulled out his phone, scrolling through what appeared to be hours of recorded footage. "I've been filming everything since I got here yesterday. I have Stone's phone calls about the poaching operation, his confession about planning to kill the lions, even the moment when you chose to stay with Hope instead of running away." Jimmy's eyes widened as he realized the implications. "Tyler, that footage could go viral," Tyler finished. "Could show people that conservation isn't just about animals, it's about the kinds of choices that define us as human beings. Could bring in funding from people who want to be part of something that proves love really doesn't have boundaries." Margaret felt tears threatening again, but these were tears of possibility rather than despair. "Show me," she said quietly. Tyler's footage was remarkable not just for its technical quality, but for the story it told. The camera had captured Margaret's face as she made her impossible choice, the lion's protective behavior toward someone they'd accepted as family, Stone's cold revelation of his true intentions, and the dramatic rescue that had saved them all. But more than that, it had captured the emotional truth of interspecies love that transcended scientific explanation. Nyota grooming Margaret's hair, Hope reaching through the fence for comfort, the entire pride positioning themselves as protectors rather than predators, it was visual proof of connections that most people would dismiss as impossible if they hadn't seen it with their own eyes. "This changes everything," Jimmy breathed as they watched the footage together. "This isn't just documentation of animal behavior. This is proof that the boundaries we think exist between species are far more fluid than we ever imagined." Margaret's phone buzzed with an incoming video call from Ohio. Emma's face appeared on the screen, pale but alert, her eyes bright with curiosity about her grandmother's adventures. "Grandma, the doctors say I'm getting better. They say the medicine you sent from the lions is really working." Emma's excitement was infectious, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Margaret replied, her heart full of gratitude for small miracles. "How would you feel about learning more about the lions? About maybe helping other children who have the same condition you do?" Emma's eyes widened with possibility. "Could I? Could I really help?" Margaret looked at Jimmy and Tyler, seeing her own determination reflected in their faces. "Would you like to be our first junior ambassador for the Hope Foundation? Help us tell other families that sometimes the most amazing medicine comes from the most unexpected places?" "Yes!" Emma's enthusiasm carried clearly through the phone's speakers. "Can I meet Hope someday? Can I see the mama lion who helped save me?" Margaret felt the final piece of her plan click into place. "I think we can arrange that, sweetheart. I think we can arrange a lot of things that seemed impossible just a few hours ago." As the African sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret sat in the enclosure with Hope sleeping peacefully in her lap, while Nyota dozed nearby. Jimmy and Tyler worked together to upload the day's footage to social media platforms, crafting a story that would soon reach millions of people around the world. The transformation that had begun with a desperate grandmother's search for a miracle was evolving into something far larger than any of them had imagined. But for now, in the quiet moment before everything changed, Margaret simply held the cub who had taught her that love truly knew no boundaries, and smiled at the knowledge that some stories really do have happy endings. The revolution in how humans understood their relationship with the natural world was about to begin, sparked by the courage of a grandmother who had refused to abandon her chosen family. 6 months later, Margaret Whitfield stood in the arrivals terminal at Jomo Kenyatta International Airport, watching her granddaughter Emma take her first steps on African soil. The 8-year-old moved with the careful confidence of someone whose bones had been rebuilt by science and strengthened by love, her eyes bright with excitement as she scanned the crowd for familiar faces. "Grandma, is that really Tyler?" Emma pointed toward a tanned, confident-looking boy who bore little resemblance to the pale 12-year-old who had saved them all during that terrifying day 6 months earlier. Tyler had grown 3 inches during his extended stay in Kenya, his shoulders broadened by daily work around the expanded Hope Foundation facility, his eyes holding the quiet confidence of someone who had found his purpose early in life. "That's him, sweetheart," Margaret replied, her voice thick with emotion as she watched Tyler embrace Emma with the protective gentleness of an older brother. "He's been working with your lions every day, getting them ready to meet you." The reunion was everything Margaret had dreamed it would be during the long months of planning, fundraising, and coordination that had made this moment possible. Jimmy emerged from the crowd with the broad smile of a man whose life had been transformed by learning to balance professional passion with family love. His son Tyler had become his research partner. His daughter figure Emma had become their program's first success story, and Margaret had become the mother figure he'd never known he needed. The drive to the Hope Foundation revealed the miraculous changes that international attention and viral social media coverage had brought to their small conservation project. What had once been a modest research facility was now a sprawling complex that included a state-of-the-art medical laboratory, educational pavilions for visiting students, comfortable accommodations for families participating in their revolutionary treatment program, and expanded enclosures that allowed the lions to roam freely while still enabling close monitoring of their health and behavior. "There are 12 families here right now," Jimmy explained as they toured the facilities. "Children from around the world whose bone disorders are being treated with the protein therapy we developed from Neota's milk. But more than that, we're documenting unprecedented levels of interspecies bonding that challenge everything the scientific community thought they knew about animal consciousness and emotional capacity." Emma listened with the rapt attention of a child who understood she was part of something historic, but her eyes kept drifting toward the large enclosure where Neota and Hope were visible in the distance. The adult lioness had grown more magnificent over the months, her coat glossy with health and her bearing regal with the confidence of a protected queen. Hope had developed into a young adult lion whose deformed leg had healed so completely that only careful examination revealed any trace of her birth defect. "They remember you, don't they?" Emma asked Margaret as they approached the viewing area. Margaret's answer came not in words, but in the immediate response from both lions when they spotted her familiar figure. Nyota rose from her resting spot and padded toward the fence with the fluid grace of a predator, but her vocalizations were the gentle chuffs of greeting she reserved for family members. Hope bounded after her mother with playful energy, pressing against the barrier and reaching through with massive paws that were somehow still gentle enough to touch Margaret's outstretched hands without causing harm. "Hello, my beautiful girls," Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face as she felt the familiar warmth of their acceptance. "I brought someone very special to meet you." Emma approached slowly, her scientific curiosity inherited from months of medical treatments balanced with the natural caution of a child meeting the most powerful predators on Earth. But Hope's response was immediate and unmistakable. The young lioness tilted her head with obvious interest, studying Emma's face with the same intelligent assessment she had once used to evaluate Margaret. "She knows," Emma breathed in wonder. "She knows I'm the little girl you were trying to save." The interaction that followed would be analyzed by animal behaviorists for years to come. Hope approached Emma with deliberate care, extending her massive head toward the child's small hands with a gentleness that defied every instinct evolution had programmed into apex predators. When Emma finally worked up the courage to stroke Hope's head through the protective barrier, the lioness began purring with the same contentment she had once shown only to Margaret. "It's like she understands that we're connected," Emma said softly. "Like she knows her mama's milk helped make me better." Margaret watched this moment with the satisfaction of someone whose impossible dream had become reality. The protein therapy derived from Neota's milk had not only saved Emma's life, but had proven effective for dozens of other children around the world. The Hope Foundation had become a pilgrimage destination for families facing similar medical crises, and the waiting list for their treatment program extended months into the future. But beyond the medical miracles, something even more profound had emerged from their work. The viral video of Margaret's choice to stay with the lions had sparked a global conversation about the nature of love, family, and the artificial boundaries humans created between species. Children around the world were growing up with a different understanding of their relationship to the natural world, one that emphasized connection rather than dominion. Tyler had become the public face of this new generation of conservationists, his youth and passion making him an effective spokesperson for sustainable wildlife protection. His TikTok videos from the foundation regularly reached millions of viewers, and his collaboration with Emma on educational content had created a new model for conservation outreach that spoke directly to young people in their own language. "Dad says we're going to expand the program to include other species," Tyler told Emma as they watched Hope play with her cubs. She had given birth to 3 healthy offspring earlier that year, ensuring the genetic continuation of their remarkable pride. Elephants, rhinos, maybe even marine mammals. The interspecies bonding research has applications far beyond lions. Emma's eyes lit up with possibility. "Could I help? Could I be part of that research?" "You already are," Margaret said gently. "Every day you're healthy, every video we make together, every time you tell your story to other families, you're helping us prove that love really doesn't have boundaries." The evening brought a celebration that would have seemed impossible during those dark days when Margaret first arrived in Kenya as a desperate grandmother searching for a miracle. The foundation's main pavilion was filled with families from around the world, their children playing together while their parents shared stories of hope found in the most unexpected places. Emma had become the unofficial mascot of this international community, her infectious enthusiasm and remarkable recovery inspiring other children to believe in possibilities their doctors had dismissed as impossible. She moved through the crowd with the confident grace of someone who had faced death and chosen life, her laughter mixing with the sounds of a dozen different languages as families from 6 continents celebrated their shared journey. Margaret found herself surrounded by parents who credited her story with giving them the courage to pursue experimental treatments for their own children. Many of them had traveled to Kenya not just for the medical therapy but for the hope that came from witnessing the profound connections that existed between the human and animal families at the foundation. "You changed everything," one mother told Margaret, tears in her eyes as she spoke. When I saw that video of you choosing to stay with the lions, I realized that love isn't something you ration. It's something you share until it multiplies beyond what you ever thought possible. As the celebration continued into the African night, Margaret found herself back at the lion enclosure, watching Nyota teach her cubs the same gentle behaviors she had learned during her interactions with humans. The pride had not lost their wild nature, but they had gained something unprecedented, the ability to distinguish between humans who came as friends and those who came as threats. Jimmy joined her at the fence, his face reflecting the contentment of a man who had found a way to heal both his professional and personal relationships. Tyler was teaching Emma the subtle differences in lion vocalizations, their heads bent together over his research notes, while Hope and her cubs provided real-time demonstrations of the behaviors they were studying. "Do you ever regret it?" Jimmy asked quietly. "Choosing to stay that day instead of rushing back to Emma immediately?" Margaret considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think about it sometimes," she admitted. "I wonder if a different grandmother would have made a different choice. But then I look at Emma, healthy and strong and part of something bigger than any of us imagined, and I know that love led me to exactly where I needed to be." The sound of children's laughter echoed across the savannah as Emma and Tyler continued their impromptu lesson, surrounded by families whose lives had been transformed by the revolutionary treatment program they had helped create. Above them, the African stars blazed with ancient light, witnesses to a new chapter in the ongoing story of connection between species that had forgotten they were meant to be family. Margaret smiled as Hope approached the fence one final time, the magnificent young lioness touching her nose gently to Margaret's outstretched hand in a gesture that had become their private greeting. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new families, new opportunities to prove that the most powerful medicine in the world was love without boundaries. Tonight, though, was for celebration, for gratitude, and for the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes impossible dreams really do come true. Margaret's story reminds us that the most profound moments in life often arrive disguised as impossible choices. When she stood between her dying granddaughter and the lions who had become her family, she discovered something that transforms how we understand love itself. It doesn't diminish when divided, it multiplies when shared. Her courage to follow her heart, even when the world questioned her sanity, created miracles that saved not just Emma's life, but launched a global movement proving that family extends far beyond blood relations. Every day, we face smaller versions of Margaret's choice. Do we play it safe, or do we trust that love will guide us towards something greater than we imagined possible? Margaret's lions taught her what many of us forget in our structured, careful lives, that the deepest connections transcend every boundary we think matters. Her willingness to risk everything for unconventional love didn't just heal her granddaughter. It healed broken relationships, reunited a father and son, and showed the world that courage looks like a grandmother refusing to abandon those who need her most. Sometimes the family we choose teaches us how to better love the family we were given. What impossible choice in your life led to unexpected blessings? Have you ever discovered family in the most surprising places? Share your story in the comments below. Your courage might inspire someone else's miracle.